NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg speaking to CTV News chief political correspondent Vassy Kapelos today in an exclusive interview following his meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau last night. Now, as you heard in that clip, Stoltenberg says he expects more from Canada when it comes to defense spending. Canada's failure to meet the 2% NATO target is something our country has faced criticism for months. You can watch the full exclusive interview with NATO's Secretary General on Question Period this Sunday at 11 Eastern or 8 Pacific on CTV and CTV News Channel. Defense Minister Bill Blair has faced questions about it ahead of Stoltenberg's visit here to Canada. And Blair has continued to point out Canada's defense budget is increasing by up to 27%. And there are discussions about a joint submarine program with Norway and Germany. The minister insists that we are on a trajectory to 2%, but the new defense policy will only see us hit 1.76% of our GDP in the year 2030. So what should Canada do ahead of the NATO summit that is coming up next month in July? Well, joining me now are two men who have served as defense ministers in this country. David Collenette served under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He's also the chair of the NATO Association of Canada, who hosted Jens Stoltenberg yesterday in Ottawa. And Peter MacKay was defense minister under Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Thank you both for joining us this evening.
Pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Mr. MacKay, I'll start with you. NATO's Secretary General will never come out and call out Canada and call them a laggard. But how are we being seen by our allies right now?
Well, unfortunately, others have called us out, Michael, including quite recently a group of bipartisan senators in the United States, arguably our most important, well, certainly in my view, our most important military ally. And they wrote directly to the Prime Minister, essentially asking that Canada come forward with a plan. And as you've laid out correctly, there's no denying the increases in defense spending, which were welcomed broadly, but it still doesn't get us to 2% in any rational way. And so you asked what needs to happen. Well, I think a revisitation of the spending priorities of government, clearly looking at what we're doing across NATO. The reason for this 2% floor, and it's a floor, not a ceiling, is about burden sharing. And perhaps the biggest takeaway from the Secretary General's visit was his reference to this being a much more dangerous world, which I think is undeniable, given what we saw happen in Ukraine, what we see happening across the Middle East, and of course the anticipated and very troubling concerns regarding China and Taiwan. And let's not forget, not to be alarmist, but Russia is an Arctic neighbor of ours.
Yeah, very true. And Mr. Collenette, I mean, having hosted Mr. Stoltenberg, or Secretary General Stoltenberg, what is your sense of what the Secretary General feels about Canada and our need to step up? I mean, he's using very diplomatic language, but if you could parse it out for viewers, is this as close to a public shaming as we're going to get?
Oh, absolutely not, Mike. Look, we hosted him yesterday. He spoke very well. He was very articulate, and he gave credit to all of the other spending that Canada's done on Ukraine. We've been one of the biggest supporters. We have our battalion, or perhaps it's a regiment, in Latvia. So we are doing our bit, and I think there's a lot of people that feel that we have to really analyze all the spending that's going on. I'm not here to say we should not get 2%. I've been publicly, along with Peter, we signed a letter, a public letter advocating reaching the 2%. But this is something that's gone on for 10 years. It was Mr. Harper that went to the Wales summit and agreed to the 2%, or at least as an aspirational target. At the time, Canada was 1%. The Trudeau government has invested, and one would argue, certainly I would, that we should have done more. But we certainly are better than we were 10 years ago, but not as good a position as we should be in. So I think that we shouldn't get sort of hung up on this. He certainly, in his public remarks to us, and it was live streamed, and I talked to him privately, he's not shimming. He just said, look, we've all got to take on the burden. We've all got to meet 2%. And, Mr. Blair in the last few days has sort of moved the goalposts a bit and said, look, we're moving ahead much more quickly than we had anticipated a few months ago. So I think we're on the right trajectory, and I would like to see more done.
To that end, Mr. MacKay, I mean, we're hearing that Canada is seemingly in discussions with Germany and Norway about a joint submarine program. That was something that Bill Blair spoke about yesterday. Does that help his argument going into that meeting in Washington, D.C.?
I don't know that it does until we've actually committed. And I certainly agree with David's comment that we're on the right trajectory when we're spending more, when we're hitting higher targets. The calculus, of course, is very important, and that's difficult to parse at times. And in real dollars, Canada does quite well. But as part of the GDP, that comes, of course, as a sort of a measure of how our economy is doing and how important defense spending is. And I would suggest, again, for emphasis, that the dial has moved, and therefore the priority should move. To answer your question about spending on a nuclear or a submarine fleet, by all means, an announcement and a commitment to do that would more than get us to 2%. But of course, then we are subject to the winds of politics. And the fear, of course, with changes in government is that governments, as we have seen, will cancel the spending priorities, commitments, contracts of other governments. And depoliticizing defense spending is something that's been talked about for a long time. Changes in the way that we procure military equipment is a change that is long overdue. And I think David would agree with that, where we have sometimes departments working at cross purposes, Public Works, Treasury Board, Industry Canada, and that delays inevitably our ability to get equipment to the troops when they need it and when they need it quickly. And so there's a lot of moving parts, to say the least, but we are the only country, as I understand it, out of 32 to have not come forward with a plan. And the most recent announced defense update was not a plan. It does not give set dates or even fixed dates as to when we will get to 2%. And I think that's what the Secretary General was hoping for, and it's certainly what our allies are looking for.
I've only got 30 seconds, Mr. Collenette, but how important is that plan, or at least a path to 2%, that every ally can see around the table when they do meet in July in D.C.?
I think it's very important. I agree with Peter, and we must have that plan, and we must reassure our allies. I agree with Peter's point about procurement. It's something that's bedeviled all levels of all governments, conservative, liberal, in the last few years. When you can get ships built in France and Italy at half the cost on time, but you can't get them built here, we have some real structural issues we have to deal with. And if we deal with them, then we can commit funds and actually bring equipment forward and have it ready for implementation, to defend Ukraine and NATO in general.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Former Defense Ministers David Collenette and Peter MacKay, thank you so much for giving us your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Michael.